Welcome back to the Kingsway Podcast.
Welcome.
Glad you're here.
We're also here.
Got a fun segment today. We got some cool things going on. Ryan, it's almost Easter.
It is almost Easter.
Are you feeling it?
I'm feeling it, Mr. Krabs. Yeah. People keep saying, oh, Easter's almost here. And I'm like, you think? Just wiping the sweat from my forehead.
I feel like when other pastors get around other pastors around Easter, it's like this kinship of suffering.
Yeah. Even though you're in different denominations, it's like somebody who served in Korea meeting somebody who served in Iraq, and you're like, I get it.
I get it. It. And it's not.
Yeah.
It I would say 95% of it genuinely is like it's the pressure you put on yourself. Like especially in the place we're at. I just want to do a good job. I want it to go well. It is kind of a special day.
Yeah. Part of it for me is like, I love Easter. I love celebrating times of the year that are important in the church and whatever. And also, I'm doing a master's program, and that makes me do a lot of stuff.
It does. And you've been doing a lot of stuff. We have the Devos that you've been doing.
Yeah.
You have a candlelight kind of Good Friday service that you're planning that I'm very excited about that we did last year as well. And then also you're just going to redesign the stage. So that's totally...
And you're missing my weekly atonement class. Hour and a half of like digging into something very heady.
Yep.
And that's the day after I lead a service.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm doing great.
You're feeling it.
You could send in some melatonin through the mail to 900.
Either
West.
that or some caffeine pills. Either
one or the other. I need them at different times of the day.
Well, today we're going to jump into a segment that we haven't done for a while. We did, I think, last summer for the first time.
Yeah.
And it was on the character of David.
Yeah.
And one of the cool things that came out of that, I think, was there was we got actually some feedback from people that they really enjoyed that segment. And
we did too. Honestly, it was one of my favorite things we did last year. I just don't know that many Bible characters. Like we could just run through the gambit, but after about 8 or 10, I'm like, Mary, she was there for a little bit, right? Or the other Mary?
What about Joseph? Where'd he go?
That would be a 3-minute episode.
No, and I think what was so fun, it was about how rich, obviously not all the characters, but of how there are a number of characters that have very rich ties to things. They have, I think, a lot to learn and to grow and to
a lot to offer us.
Yeah, and just to investigate and be curious about. And they're also people, and so the part of like the humanity side of things, and so. Today we're going to dive into a character that kind of has two different names, one that obviously sticks more than the other. And it's a character that is pretty common. And I jokingly mentioned this before we started the podcast that I once tried to read an N.T. Wright book on this character. And I literally listened to about 10 minutes and then immediately returned the book because I was not smart enough to handle the level of academia.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to claim that I know everything. Or that I have it all figured out. But I think we have enough to have a healthy discussion and kind of maybe whet your appetite for more too. Because there's always, I think there's things to be learned. And we can always move forward and gain understanding. So we're going to talk about Paul. Also known as Saul.
The artist formerly known as Saul.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the best way to say it. Author of... I think, let's see.
The most books in the New Testament, for sure.
The most. I'm trying to think of the number, but I can't pull it off. So
There's 23 or 33. This
33.
is bad.
There's 33.
We have Bible degrees.
33 in the New Testament, 64 in the Old, right? 60. Oh my God.
There's a lot of books in the Bible.
66 books in the whole Bible.
And that's why I think it was like 23 and 30, whatever.
We have Google.
Anyway, so Paul wrote a lot of the books. He didn't write any of the Gospels.
Nope.
Specifically, he didn't write the book of Acts. He didn't write Revelation. He didn't write 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John or 1st and 2nd Peter. Probably didn't write Hebrews. Other than that, everything else, I'm pretty sure is stuff he wrote. Or at least it's widely attributed to him.
13 books.
13 books?
Mhm.
He wrote 13?
Mhm.
Okay. He wrote 13 books of the however many are in the New Testament.
Yes.
I think I just named 10.
10 of them. I was going to say
Something like that.
Well, some of them have 2 pieces or 2 parts. And there's that. And here's the thing about Paul. Paul is, he, there's a lot to talk about here. I will say this. Paul is a recognized tactician when it comes to literary stuff. He studied as even at
Very
places
educated.
like Harvard, for even the way he writes his letters.
Yeah.
He's known for run-on sentences that just last forever.
Which was okay back then.
Yep, he just keeps going. He's also known to have some opinions that are very divisive at times.
Yeah.
And I would almost call him a polarizing figure of the New Testament.
Sure. Why don't we start at the beginning?
Yeah, let's. I mean, I just kind of setting the table, but let's do that. Let's talk about the background that's in Acts, to where we get some of the kind of the roots of his story.
So, to my knowledge, the first time we see Paul, so this happens to a bunch of characters in the Bible where they have one name and then God interacts with them and they have a new name.
Yep.
So this kind of happens with Peter, whose name is originally Simon.
Mm-hmm.
That's why he's called Simon Peter, but I don't know what Simon means in Greek or Hebrew or anything. But his name is Simon. He's called by Jesus to be one of his disciples. And then Jesus at some point, I think in some of the books, some of the Gospels, it's when he says, your name should be Peter, and on this rock, which Peter means rock, Petros, means rock, and on this rock I will build my church. So this happens to a lot of people. Abram to Abraham. There's probably some more examples in there. But Abraham's wife Sarai to Sarah. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so Paul's name is originally Saul.
Yeah.
And I think the first place we see him, are you at Acts 8?
Right
7?
before 7.
Yeah. Whatever is the hinge verse between chapter 7 and chapter 8, there's this guy who the apostles of Jesus, his 12 disciples minus one, because he was Judas and he betrayed Jesus and they committed suicide and it was really messy.
It's really nasty.
And then they get a new one.
Feel
Anyway,
the blood.
Those 12, they can't do everything the church needs after it's formed. There's like 3,000 people and they're sharing everything they have, but like they have these responsibilities to lead and to guide and to evangelize. And they can't do all that and do what they know they need to do, take care of orphans and widows. So they appoint these 7 people, one of whom's name is Stephen, to be the orphan widow caretakers in the church. And Stephen goes out and is doing that and then is preaching or gets arrested for something. And that's chapter 6 and 7. And he gives this whole speech in 7.
It's an incredible speech.
That is like, you got this all wrong. I need to use my dying moments to tell you about Jesus, who you killed because he's still in Jerusalem, whatever. Okay, so they're about to put him to death. And chapter 7 is wrapping up. Verse 60, trying to read past this glare. Then he fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. When he had said this, he fell asleep, which he died. He died. He got stoned to death. Next verse. And Saul approved of their killing him. That is the first time we hear about Saul. For a Jew who doesn't think, an ancient Jew who doesn't think that Jesus is the Messiah, who thinks that these guys are all nut jobs and just like crazy and fanatical about whatever, and you're trying to maintain holiness and purity, yes, you want to kill that dude.
Yeah.
Saul thinks he's doing a good job when he's here approving of the killing of this man. But we read about Saul's story after chapter 8. And then we go through some cool stories and we get to chapter 9. Saul comes back in the scene. So he's there right at the hinge between chapter 7 and 8. And he's just there for a second showing that he's like in favor of killing.
Yeah, and Saul's story is just, it's wild because it starts with like this, basically an approval of martyrdom. Like it ends up turning Stephen into a martyr, the first.
Yeah.
And then, he's basically, I think, almost commissioned by the Pharisees to the teachers of the law. We don't really know exactly what that means. But it seems like even the Sadducees and Pharisees that agreed on almost nothing all agreed that Jesus was a bad idea. And so they are like sending him out to do this more. Like they're like hearing about other places that the gospel is spreading, and they're like, you need to go put these fires out. And so he's heading to Damascus to basically do this again. And he has this encounter where this light, kind of basically knocks him off his donkey or knocks him on his butt. And, Jesus himself speaks to Saul, which is like crazy.
Yeah.
And the way that this attaches so much to Moses and the burning bush and like just this idea of like the mountaintop experience with Elijah and Abram with Mount of Transfiguration.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like these moments where when Jesus shows up and God and, these intentional spaces, there seems to be drastic change in the people that like
so much so that when no, never mind. I was about to say Moses changed his name, but he didn't.
He didn't.
Was always
he didn't.
Moses.
But he had, when he comes off with the 10 Commandments after spending time with God, he glowed.
Yeah.
Like he has like a different. So there's just these encounters, and this seems to be one of those where God physically blinds Saul with this light after Jesus says, why do you persecute me? And it's this like revelation that I'm sure, and I don't know if you've ever thought of this, well, Paul is putting this together for the first time, that these are stories that he's read about.
Yeah.
These are things that he's aware of, that this is kind of like, oh, snaps, I'm on the wrong side. I'm on the wrong team.
Yeah.
And so he blinds him. He tells him he needs to go into this town, and he needs to meet with this guy. What's that guy's name again? I can't remember.
It's not Barnabas, is it?
It might be.
It might be. I'm going to check that out real quick.
Oh, gosh. And then one of my favorite names in
Ananias?
Yes, he meets Ananias.
Yeah.
And Ananias basically gives him some food, and then
Ananias is a little freaked out.
Oh, totally freaked out.
So this is literally like the religious bounty hunter after you. This is, I can think of a few movie characters who are like this. But one specifically, I don't know if I'll get in trouble for this, but the Da Vinci Code, Paul Bettany's like this albino monk who's also there to like kill you and whatever, and super freaky, and like everybody's terrified of him for a bunch of reasons. Well, imagine that guy's like, hey, I heard about the reason why people are mad at you, and I think I believe you. Like, how quickly are you going to be like, come on in. Don't kill me, though.
Don't kill me. Well, and show me the inner workings of your, the people you love, and like where you're going to, and all that. And it's
kind of scary.
Rightfully so. There's a little hesitation. Saul eventually goes to this pool, washes his eyes, receives his eyesight, and then eats again because he hasn't eaten since he lost it. And then it's like this slow unfolding of his story, because everybody's kind of hesitant, and they want to believe that he's been changed. They want to believe that this is. But specifically, he goes to work with this guy named Barnabas. Saul does, and his name now is Paul. So Paul goes to work with Barnabas, and Barnabas and Paul begin to do this ministry together in kind of the north side of Israel. And the reputation gets such that basically they send somebody to come check out that it's the truth.
Yeah.
They're like, hey, is what you're doing really what you're doing?
What reminds me of this, and this may not be a good example because based on world events, I don't know if it stuck, but it reminds me of about 2 or 3 years ago when everybody was like, is Kanye West a Christian now? He's running around with the Sunday service choir and let out an album called Jesus is Lord and whatever. And about that situation, I think there's like some mental health stuff going on and other stuff. But there's this moment where everybody was like, this guy used to seem almost antagonistic, or like he celebrated the opposite of what we're about.
Yep.
And now is he in? Is he part of this?
100%.
Same thing with Justin Bieber, even though he started out as a Christian, and then, like his life got really crazy. And then like he's turning around now, and you're watching like reels and YouTube videos of him like being a sincere Christian and talking to his pastor, but then he'll like go out and sing about whatever, and you're like, is he in?
Yep, 100%.
Yeah.
And there's a little less like flip-flop in Paul's life than maybe some of those. Obviously, Paul is actually following Jesus, has had a full conversion, but I think the hesitation of the culture inside the church and the hesitation of the leadership is feeling that tension. Because it's not like they're seeing his tweets and they're seeing his, TikToks.
And it's not matching up.
Yeah, it's not like that at all. Yeah. It's more of they were hearing the story of Stephen, and they're hearing the story of what his reputation was for putting in prison and like, basically taking out the church, has still just kind of hung on. So Paul goes from that to taken to Jerusalem, and they confirm, guess what? He actually is converted. I think he reveals his kind of testimony. I don't know if Ananias goes, but Barnabas at least has enough of a, handle on it. And so from then, Paul starts doing just crazy evangelism work. I mean, just crazy stuff.
A lot of people call him the first missionary of the church, which is funny because like the first overseas traveling kind of missionary of the church, because Jesus at the end of Matthew, he has died, he is resurrected, he is about to ascend into heaven. And I think the beginning of Acts 2 has a version of this. But Jesus at the end of Matthew is there with his disciples, the 12 people he's been, 11, sorry, Judas, the 11 people he's been training for this thing. And he gives them the Great Commission right at the end of the book, chapter 28 of Matthew. And he says, go into all the world and tell them about me and teach them to obey my commandments and baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And I will be with you always to the end of the age. And so what do? They hide away and just kind of stick to themselves for about 30, 40 something days till Pentecost. And then they receive the Holy Spirit. They preach. They gain 3,000 converts. And then they're like, okay, how do we run this organization? They don't all get up and go to all nations, languages. They kind of sit there and they're doing good work. They're not being lazy. They're not being bad. They're trying to like be with these people who have seen Jesus and want to like follow him. They're doing honestly good things, but they're not following Jesus' commandment to preach in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. They're just doing Jerusalem.
Yep.
And so then they get this like religious bounty hunter guy on their side, and he's the first one to go out.
Yep.
There are different moments called diasporas where from crushing events from the outside, the Christians gathered in Jerusalem are kind of like oppressed and pressed down. And just like something flexible that's pressed down, it kind of splooshes out the sides and whatever. So there are these moments, AD 70 is one of them, where the temple's destroyed and they all scatter. They all flee and scram. And then they go to the ends of the earth. And there are moments before that where Christians do that. But Paul is the first one to be like, okay, I'm out of here.
Well, and
I'm
he
ready.
does it several times. I mean, that's the crazy thing. I think he does 3 separate journeys. And, the first one, he heads out to the island that's in the Mediterranean. I think it's Crete. What is the island?
Something like that.
And finds Timothy. And, he takes with him John Mark. And Barnabas.
Who's the author of the Gospel of Mark.
Yep. And John Mark freaks out and has to leave because they're on ships. And we find out from some of his later letters that he's shipwrecked. He's been, all this stuff and everywhere he's going. And then he starts running into these cities on kind of I would say it's almost like the south side of Europe. Where it's, it's these little Asia Minor, Turkey. And so the letters that he has are to these cities. And so maybe you've always wondered, like, where did these books come from? Or you're reading these parts in the New Testament.
And I always heard that they were books. And only as an afterthought, they talked about them as letters. In my head, I was like, books. This is Paul talking to every Christian everywhere. He's just like, hey, I had a few minutes and I'm going to write down things that are gospel and that are the Bible now. And that's not how it happened.
No.
He was an evangelist and a disciple maker and writing these letters to churches he had planted to correct what direction they were headed in, to guide them, to maybe encourage them in directions they were headed in, and just to kind of keep up with these churches he had planted as he would pick up and move to the next one.
And it definitely was like a modern day evangelist. I mean, he's just going town to town. He uses the shipping lanes. He uses the Roman road, which is one of the largest infrastructures that the Romans actually did, was these almost like wagon cart, like very well maintained roads for trade. And so these cities would spring up in places that the Roman road and the ports were close enough to, Ephesians, Philippi, Corinth, all these places had these points of contact for all these different.
They had value because they were on the road.
Exactly. So
it's like us in Mount Vernon. We're on I-44. If they built I-44 10 miles away to Monette or whatever, I feel like we'd be way smaller. We're not already that big, but we'd be way smaller 100%. And they'd be way bigger.
100%. And so, Paul's strategically going there, but the whole time, even on each one of these journeys, you can tell that he knows he needs to go to Rome. Like he needs to get to Rome. And these journeys are intense. He raises up a mentor, he mentors and raises up another leader named Timothy, who he writes a couple letters to later. He interacts with a slave that has run away from his master, and he's calling him to return, and Philemon. And then you have these letters that seem to be conversational, where he seems to have visited multiple times, and he's responding to specific cases, and he just seems to have like a lot of irons in the fire. Like when you read these letters, you're like, this is one life in before 70 AD. Like, it's a short amount of time that a lot of this is going on. It's pretty intense. One
thing I want to clarify is his personality and his character. So we had said from the Christian perspective, he had seemed unrighteous from a Christian perspective. He's out there trying to kill Christians. He's antagonistic. But he talks in Philippians 3. He gives his faith pedigree because Christianity sprung out of Judaism. Yep. Judaism is God's chosen people waiting for the Messiah, and Jews today think that Messiah has not shown up.
Yeah.
But Christians today think that he did, and so this was this split here. And in Philippians 3, he gives his faith pedigree. So things that apply to Judaism would be like still be bonus points for Christianity in general. But he's trying to say, like, don't put your confidence in your pedigree.
Yep.
So he gives his anyway to say, I'd be better than you, and I don't put confidence in mine.
Yep.
So in Philippians 3, he says, if someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. In regard to the law, a Pharisee. I don't know if we've talked about Pharisees a ton on here. But they are literally the religion police.
Yep.
The same way you would jokingly say, like,
I'm the Navy SEAL of religious people.
Yeah. And their whole job is to go out here and police you.
Yep.
It's like however you feel when you're at your grandma's house and you accidentally curse and you're like, I hope she doesn't get on to me about that.
Yep.
Like that times 10, and it's their job, and they don't have to be related.
Well, and they also follow things like Jesse just preached a sermon on Sunday just talking about this, but like if the speed limit was 70, they didn't go over 65. Like they just had that many rules in the way they
had
follow.
God's rules, which are like arguably about 613. And then for each of those and more, they had rules outside of those rules. So you wouldn't get close to breaking the inner rule because you didn't break the outer rule.
Yep.
And they would treat those like they were the same. So Pharisee, super legalistic, super righteous according to the law. So, in regard to the law, Pharisee, as for zeal, as for my passion for serving God, a persecutor of the church. His stoning of Stephen was part of his pedigree. I'm so zealous about what God wants out of this world, or what I think he wants, that I'm willing to go out here and kill Christians. As for righteousness based on the law, faultless. So he wasn't a pushover. He wasn't a deadbeat before.
No.
He was trying his hardest. And what he realizes when he meets Jesus in Acts 9 is that he was just misguided, that God's own son appears to him and says, why are you persecuting me? And he realized that he was super off base. Even at the beginning of Acts 9, when it's talking like kind of hinging over from Acts 7 to 8, when he was there with the stoning of Stephen, the beginning of it says, meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, to Christianity, whether men or women, he might, dramatic page turn, take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. This was like not an act of just hating Christians, not an act of, this was him trying to follow God the best he knew
he's trying
how.
to protect the church.
Yeah.
Or at least protect, the Jewish faith at the time.
So what's cool is his name is Saul. Mm-hmm. Is there another Saul in the Bible? Yes, the first king of Israel, who was not very righteous. He was very selfish and tried to use God to his own advantage. But the guy after him, David, was, other than some select choice few times and really badly when he did, listened to God and relied on God and trusted in God and is said to be a man after God's own heart. So Saul has this name after the legacy of a guy who was not after God's own heart. And he is trying to correct that. He wants to be a man after God's own heart. As for zeal and passion, me pursuing God's own heart, I even persecuted the church.
And his story is so incredibly powerful because he will speak directly to groups of Christians from these cities, and eventually he will even preach and talk to and write his largest letter, Romans, to the Roman church. This church that actually was, when he got there thinking he was going to plant it, someone had beat him there, and the church already existed to a degree. And so he's writing this letter to, kind of encourage, but also correct and talk about the transforming power, talk about this new life. I mean, you don't have time to go in all those letters, but you see the heart change that you're talking about, I think, in one of his most powerful statements or verses pulled out of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, when he talks about this thorn in the flesh. And you hear the heart of Paul. Paul is not just about commanding obedience and righteousness, though he does say it is worth more than gold and it is worth pursuing, and having Christ at the center of your life and fixing your eyes on him is important. He also says things like this, talking about his own weakness. I was given a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I begged the Lord to take it away, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecution, and in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. The heart of that, of the humility of that, of trying to recognize that everything he's doing, he sees his own limitations, and he is constantly just trying to trust in God's power to show up again. And that to me as a pastor, I love that, where it's like, no, I have things in my life that I can't all get right. I can't get perfectly right. And so I'm trying to navigate that, starting to hand that back over to God and recognize that the broken parts of me are the things that God can still work through, which is good.
Yeah. I think you see Paul's heart, whatever you want to say about his beginning of his life up to meeting Jesus on that Damascus road. And if you've ever heard that phrase before, I had a Damascus road experience. They're talking about Paul. They're referencing Paul in talking about themselves. But you see him at a like a midlife crisis level crossroads, where he is absolutely broken by it. And I think the height from which he fell helped him to be as obedient as he was and as faithful as he was, along with the Holy Spirit and some other things. And it helped him to truly be all in and not try to carry his Judaism with him. He had it. He could use it. He even says at one point, I want to be all things to all people so that I might win some.
Yeah.
So it's something he's ready and willing to use, his experience as a Jewish man of faith, super zealous, super faithful, super obedient. But like, he doesn't try to carry it like I talked about in Philippians 3 with him to say, look at how good of a Christian I am.
No. I mean, it's powerful. Philippians is definitely my favorite letter by him.
Yeah.
It's the one that we're even studying in our small group right now, which I really enjoy. All of his letters have incredible moments and I think are incredibly powerful when you study them. Even in Acts, I think watching his kind of narrative unfold and like seeing how much some of these, you read through Acts and you can kind of read the chronological kind of what's going on in these trips. And so then having that knowledge when you go back and read the epistles and these letters, I think it kind of helps it make more sense to like what he's accomplishing and the specifics about, so he went to this town and then he went to this town and they went to this town and they went to this town. And then you read these letters and you're like, oh, wow. Like some of this actually stuck, like some of this is actually working. Paul has a really unique place in kind of the, I would say the American church too, and maybe the world. I'm not as familiar with that, but he has like the same amount of influence as some of the apostles, but he was not a disciple of Christ before, Christ died. So like it's kind of a unique place that he has a lot of letters, a lot of influence in the Western church specifically, but it doesn't have that like apostleship, that like one of the 12 crowning, which is kind of a unique thing, I think, to talk about. I mean, it's kind of
that's
an interesting.
One of the craziest parts of the book of Acts that he is the least qualified, him and the 12 disciples. He's the least qualified out of them in terms of like leadership handed down by Jesus. But at some point they recognize that he kind of is an apostle just like them, even though he wasn't one of Jesus' original 12 followers, even though whatever. But I think what's powerful in his given apostleship is his testimony about Jesus directly. They all saw Jesus crucified. They all saw Jesus resurrected when he went to the upper room and maybe met him on the shore and some other resurrection appearances. But none of them had a moment like Paul did, where Jesus has resurrected, he has ascended. You think he's not in the picture anymore in a cameo kind of way. And then he stops because he thinks Paul is an important enough person to get a hold of.
Yep.
Because the testimony of him turning from being so zealously against the church to in love with the church and aspiring to be weak so that God could be shown to be strong through him. It's like such a big testimony that he goes after him anyway.
Oh, no. And I honestly think that's part of the reason why his testimony has such a deep impact, especially in the Jewish world, because, you know, Jesus says things like, I have come to complete the law. Like I'm coming, I'm the fullness of the law, like played out. Like, and it would take somebody that would know the law to that level to identify what Jesus is talking about. And so a lot of the theological stuff that Paul's breaking down has the fullness of the whole Bible picture, not just this crazy moment of resurrection, right? Not just this one. He's putting all the pieces together and trying to help even the Jewish audience. And that's most of the time what he did was he went to the synagogues of the city first and then would, filter out to the Gentiles. And so, there's simple places like Mars Hill when he actually goes straight to kind of the public square of thought and wisdom and lays stuff out. But very rarely is that the first place he goes. It's most of the time the synagogue. I love this character, and I know we've been talking for enough. What would we? I mean, in my mind, one of the things you should do is you should go to Acts and you should read Paul's accounts of his journeys.
Yeah,
you can Google it easy. You can just say like Paul's first missionary journey. Where's it at in the Bible? And you can identify it, and you can read the stories and read kind of the whole play out. It's powerful to kind of know that, and then recognize some of the cities. Ephesus, Philippi, Corinth. You break down some of those, Galatia. You can break down these regions and areas. Rome. You can break down where those letters were probably coming from, and you can see geographically in some maps and stuff. I think it makes it more real when you start to realize these aren't just like random things slapped together.
Yeah. I my first semester of Bible college, I had to take the class on the book of Acts and this whole like post-resurrection story of the church and whatever. And my final project for that, you had to do some creative project. I busted out my Settlers of Catan board game and recreated the Asia Minor like trips that he went on and had sticky notes about where certain places were and it was really dorky.
That's awesome.
But I was really proud of it.
I did the same thing, but I traced it onto a board and traced it onto a poster and tracked it. And it's really cool to see like, where you got shipwrecked, like where some of this stuff was happening and all that. So,
but the cool thing to me is, so the guy who wrote the book of Acts that is like detailing Paul's history, where in a lot of the letters we get a snapshot of his relationship with somebody or with a group. In detailing his history, this guy, it seems like he's getting secondhand accounts for a while. And then at some point in the book of Acts, he shows up, the author of the book, who's like the historian trying to track all this down. And that's when, that's right before he gets shipwrecked. That's right before he gets arrested or kind of around that time. And so you have the whole account of Paul's testimony in Acts 9. And then I think 3 more times he tells it. And they don't just say Paul gave his story about how he met Jesus. They say like the testimony. They write it out 3 more explicit times.
Yep.
And so you watch this historian, this record keeper walk up to Paul and meet him and go on his journey with him. And he's recording every time Paul is retelling his own story. And his own story is his weapon and his like evangelism tactic toward unbelievers and Roman officials and all these random people. And it's crazy to see like how he's using his own story, even though he has all this knowledge of the Jewish scriptures, to people who maybe it wouldn't even matter to.
Oh, of course. And he leveraged just everything in his life that way. And eventually, he's beaten and done all this stuff to over and over again. and I forget which town it was, but he was beaten to the point of death, and he just went right back in and started preaching again. But eventually he uses it to get a ticket to Rome. Because he is beaten one time in a way that a Roman citizen was not allowed to be beaten in. And he was treated in a way that a Roman citizen was not allowed. And so rather than just kind of like settle it, he actually says he wants to go and plead his case to, the emperor. And so he actually is on his way to Rome and is in Rome for a large portion of some of these letters too, and house arrest, and he's kind of waiting his time. And we know eventually, spoilers, but that time with the emperor doesn't go very well, and he ends up being killed himself. And so the whole time you kind of know that Paul ends up dying for the thing that he is so sold out on. I mean, this guy is just absolutely in love with Jesus. He wants everybody that he comes in contact to experience what he's experienced, and to see the transformation in him as an offer to see what God could do in them. The character of Paul really has a deep impact into, I would call it gospel theology. There's a lot of ways that Paul unpacks some things about what Jesus actually did on the cross. I know you're teaching this class. There's a lot of different ways that we can kind of change and take the diamond of the gospel and see the different facets and the depth of it. And Paul does a really good job of opening up our eyes to the fullness of what Jesus really did.
He's such a scholar, and that comes through. But even in the book of 1 Corinthians, listen to me. Even in the first letter to the church at Corinth, they're used to good speakers, people who are smooth and polished and whatever. And he's like, I can't keep up, and I don't want to. I'd rather speak jumbled, and I'd rather speak in a bumpy, not smooth way, so that like all you will be able to say good about my speech is that Jesus was in it. But he's heading towards Rome at the end of his life. He's preaching to everybody he can. And one of the coolest or weirdest parts of the book of Acts, this like chronograph, this is writing. Yeah, it's just writing down about his life. And you get to the end of the book of Acts, chapter 28, the last couple verses. He's in house arrest in Rome or something like that in his own rented house. It says, for 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. ! Done.
Game over.
It's the biggest cliffhanger. It's bigger than Avengers Endgame. Like, it's like,
yep.
And then what?
No.
What happened after that? Either there is a 3-volume set where Luke, the author, wrote the gospel according to Luke, wrote the book of Acts, and then wrote the rest of what happened to Paul.
And we didn't get it.
Or he doesn't know, like, that's his lifespan, whatever. And he ends it there specifically to encourage Christians in their own boldness, in their own preaching about the Lord Jesus Christ without hindrance.
Yep. And I think when my studies, when I look at it, it seems to be either the time period that Luke eventually left and then didn't have any more to record and is only recording what he knows. And I think, as a whole, the character of Paul is just an incredible one that I hope we just basically touched enough of different aspects and enough of different things to maybe get you curious about looking into him more. Because I think we cannot do it justice in a 30-minute podcast on this character. Like, Paul deserves more time than this. And so I want you to read through the books of Acts, or check out some of his letters. Like, read one of the small ones. Like,
there's some tiny ones. Philippians is a great place to start. It's 4 chapters. In my Bible, not this one, it's like, I don't know, 3 pages.
And it's
4 pages.
It's easy. There's some resources on, the Bible Project. You can watch the breakdowns of the books. You can get some understanding as you kind of read. But I highly encourage you to check out some of Paul's stuff because he has deep impact. Well, I know we are always looking for comments and other things that you would like to see us talk about. Maybe there's another biblical character or someone that we should be discussing. put that in the comments. Or maybe there's another podcast topic or thing you're looking for us to discuss soon that maybe we haven't done in a while. We have hoping to get some new people on here. We have hopefully some things lined up here in the next couple months. I know we're breathing down the neck of Easter. So once Easter's over, and I think it kind of opens some things up. Yeah. Always feel like if our content is worth a subscribe, go for it, or leave us a review. But until next time, have a great and glorious day in the Lord. We'll see you guys later.
See ya.